Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cindy Peterson with Northern Lakes Community Mental Health. I'd like to welcome you to our Tools for Resilience, the lunchtime virtual education program. We have our second program, which we are very excited to present to you, called Navigating Conflict Resolution. And I just want to point out that once you actually link into any of these events, you are on that link. At the end of all of these programs, we're going to have this available in our libraries, both for North Country Community Mental Health and Northern Lakes Community Mental Health. So you'll be able to view the program. And just wanted to tell you that we have just an exciting array of programs that we have available, and just look online at any of our websites, and we would be glad to have you be a part of that. I'm going to have Bree start. I just lost her introduction. I'm sorry. I had it on my phone, and Bree, I just lost it because I had it on my other phone, and now all of a sudden it blanked out. And so I'm going to have you introduce yourself. I wanted to just say, because it was very interesting. I know you had lived in small towns and large towns. You had also been our person here at Northern Lakes Community Mental Health, and also the NMRE. But if you would introduce yourself, that I would so appreciate that. Sorry, I just lost it on my phone here.
I will just say I'm not disappointed by that. It's the first introduction I ever wrote. So maybe it's for the best. But if I remember correctly, what I said was I am Bree Molazan. I am the current customer service specialist and the regional SUD recipient rights advisor for the NMRE region. I entered the workforce when I was 14 years old, and I've done everything from being a waitress to being a legal aid to now being customer service. And I've lived in large towns and small towns and everywhere in between. And the one thing that has always been a constant in my changing location and my changing career is conflict. I think everybody has some sort of conflict, whether that be with coworkers, whether that be with an individual that you might just have a conflict with it, at the line in the grocery store. So no matter where you're at, there will always be conflict. And I hope today that I can give you guys a few tips on how to handle that conflict resolution. So we will get into it. I'm going to turn off my camera so that we can focus on the presentation, and I won't be distracting to that. Okay. So for conflict resolution in general, there are 8 easy steps to come to your resolution. You should stay calm, validate, don't take it personally, avoid arguing, be gentle, be assertive, take responsibility, and focus on a solution. For step 1, of course, we're going to want to stay calm. When you are in any kind of conflict, keeping level-headed and unemotional is key. Because when I have a conflict with somebody and the emotions start to get really intense and high, then it just escalates the situation. When you remain calm and level-headed, it helps the situation to stay that way. There's no escalation. So you can stay calm by breathing. Slow yourself down and take a few deep breaths. It can make all the difference in how you respond. Sometimes, when you have that, you want to just respond right away, but then sometimes it's really good to just take a few deep breaths and think about how you're going to respond before you jump to it. Protect your personal space. If an angry individual enters your personal space, take a few steps back to give yourself that space. You will not be successful in remaining calm if you feel physically threatened or uncomfortable. So give yourself that space. Know your emotions. Recognize when you're feeling what you're feeling in the moment. You don't necessarily need to act on your emotion, but naming your emotions at that moment can help subside the frustration, and it can help you quell the overwhelmingness of those emotions. Call in an alternative. At some point in your career, or really anywhere, it will be inevitable that you will have to de-escalate an individual that you are in conflict with. But if you're able to get a colleague, a friend, anybody to sub for you temporarily while you collect yourself, it could really help in the long run. So if you're able to take a few minutes and then you can come back with some fresh ideas and when you're calm again. Step 2 is validate. Whether or not you agree with an agitated individual, that's not important. Okay, so what you need to focus on is not the opinion, but what's happening in the real time. To de-escalate someone who's ineffectively expressing anger, you'll need to be kind and respectful towards them. I know that can be really hard, especially if something has escalated. And it's really intense. It's really hard to remain, at least for me, to remain kind and respectful. Like I just want to let it all out and approach it at that moment impulsively. So it's really good to be able to maintain your head. Tell the individual you hear and understand what they're saying, even if it doesn't really make sense to you. Don't forget to use reflective listening. So what reflective listening is if someone says to you, I'm really angry because, you ate the last cupcake. Then you can say, I hear that you're angry because I ate the last cupcake. So just reflect on what they're saying so that they know that you're listening and you understand what the conflict is at hand. Remember, if the individual is emotional, that they are probably not being totally logical in that moment. So also give yourself and the person that you are in conflict with a little grace. Validate. It's easy to sound condescending, especially if you're trying to rush through the conflict because you're uncomfortable or irritated. Rushing could jeopardize any positive outcomes. Instead, take time to hear the individual's concerns and let them know you're listening. We just talked about reflective listening and how important that is. Showing them that what they say matters can not only de-escalate someone in a heightened emotional state, it can also be the foundation from which you build a long-lasting relationship of trust once the problem is resolved. So that's particularly important if you have an ongoing relationship with someone where you have ongoing conflict. Of course, a long-lasting relationship is not necessarily something that you would build with someone that you're having conflict with at the grocery store or wherever. But you just want to make sure that in the end you're able to trust each other, because that's how you're going to earn that resolution. Don't take it personal. This is, I feel like, for myself, this is the most difficult part of conflict resolution for me. I want to take everything personal. When someone has a conflict with me, and it sometimes escalates to actually being personal, where they say personal things about you, or come after your character or something like that. And that's really difficult for me. So this is the one that I focus on the most when I have conflict because I know it's my weakness. So don't take it personal. One of the quickest ways to reach conflict resolution is to ensure that you're not taking anything personally. It might be hard not to take things personally, whether or not the angry individual is overtly trying to make it personal. Your task, and it's a tall one, is to stay above the personal attacks. And that's so very difficult. So, going back to like the staying calm and maybe using some breathing techniques or swapping out with someone for a minute during the conflict is really important at this don't take it personal step. One of the reasons it's important to separate yourself from the individual's comments is because if you feel you have to defend yourself, adding calming, validating, cool-headedness that could resolve the conflict goes right out the door. You might start lashing out in return, and that doesn't lead to an effective ending, right? That's just going to escalate the situation and it's going to get out of hand. So I'm just going to say it one more time. Don't take it personal. Step 4 is don't argue. This is also a really difficult step. Actually, if I'm going to be honest, almost all 8 steps are kind of difficult, but the don't argue is very difficult too, especially when things are escalating. Maybe you haven't been successful yet in the other tactics and emotions are getting really intense and they're attacking you, personally, and you're still kind of just taking it personally. Just don't argue. Just whatever you do, don't argue. When you take attacks personally and become defensive, you react impulsively. Likewise, the individual feels invalidated by you trying to prove them wrong. Be flexible, let go of being right, and work toward a collaborative solution rather than opposing the individual in order to make a point. One of the most important conflict resolution tips is to avoid opposition. And the best way to avoid opposition and conflict is with open communication. So let's talk about that open communication for a minute. Sometimes it's hard to have that open communication, especially if this is just an individual that you ran into on the street and you have a conflict with. That's really hard because as humans, we're just naturally guarded. But when you have the conflict, it's so important to be honest and communicate your feelings because you're not going to receive resolution or reach resolution if you can't be open about what you're feeling and what the conflict itself is. So it's really important to be able to open yourself up to that. Step 5, be gentle. How we deliver words can greatly affect an interaction. You must implement the skill on a frequent basis and might use it to mitigate conflict before it even begins. It's a simple concept, made simpler if you consider how you prefer to be spoken to, especially when you're upset. So if you're having a conflict with someone and let's say you're sitting across from each other at a table, you're leaning back in your chair, you have your arms folded, right? This goes back to like to your mannerisms, right? Your body language. You want open body language because that closed off body language actually means that you're closed off emotionally as well. And that's not something that you want. If there's a conflict with someone, maybe someone has a conflict with you that you're not aware of, and they want to approach you and they want to talk to you about it, but they can't because you seem standoffish. So those are the kinds of things that you definitely want to be aware of is just, your tone, how you say it, how you come across, all that is really important because if you're acting defensive or you are taking it personally, you might be able to say, I'm not defensive, I'm not taking this personally, but your body's going to give you away. And those are cues that we all pick up on. Those are things that we all see. So there is this method, and if you remember it, it's great. So it's called the give method. Gentle, interested, validate, easy manner. So when you're talking to someone, this is, if you remember those four, like if you come away with anything today, if you remember the give method, it will help you in any conflict. Again, doesn't matter what kind of conflict it is, whether it's with a boss, a coworker, someone that your agency serves, or a friend, a parent, anybody. Okay, there's conflict everywhere. And so just be gentle, be interested in what the person is saying. You don't want to be dismissive, of course, because if you're dismissive, then you will never know what the actual issue at hand is, what the conflict is. Validate, which we've already talked about, validate those feelings, and then be laid back in the easy manner. No crossed arms, no scowls on your face, nothing that gives you away that way. The gentle approach continued. By being gentle and using an easy manner, you're being mindful of your tone of voice, body language, and vocabulary. Earlier, I had mentioned the condescending tone. And that for me personally is something that gets me very quickly if someone is condescending with me. So you never want to use that tone with anybody because people are going to shut down right away. They're going to get, you're going to receive that pushback because nobody likes the condescending attitude. Also, we just talked about body language, but vocabulary. So if you're in conflict with someone, let's say it even, escalates to the point where it's almost, yelling at each other or screaming at each other, profanities will make it that much worse because it just intensifies the emotions. And it doesn't just have to be profanities, your vocabulary in general, you know, I I used to have this friend who had a coworker, and her coworker would get under her skin on purpose by trying to use these like really formal big words because he knew that it annoyed her, and that was a conflict that they had. And so your vocabulary, keep it casual, keep it understandable. You just want to be approachable and open at this point. And profanities, and if you're with someone who might not understand the Oxford Dictionary words, then don't use them. Instead of hurling curse words at a frustrated customer, posturing toward them to assert your authority, or using a short tone, try being more open, friendly, and kind. I know, again, this is a difficult task because when you have conflict, when you think of conflict, the last thing I'm thinking about is being open and friendly and kind to someone. When I think of conflict, the first thing that comes to mind is like a fight. So that's something that you have to be really cognizant of and be aware of, and keep your cool and keep an open mind, friendly demeanor, and a kind demeanor. Smile, even if you're not feeling particularly inspired. Smile. Using these skills just might lead the individual that you're having a conflict with to put some faith in you. When you are easygoing and someone's coming at you, and you remain open and friendly and kind to them, it'll start to de-escalate them. Step 6 is be assertive. So I just told you to be gentle, and now I'm telling you to be assertive. But you got to find the the balance of that, because you also do need to be assertive. There are boundaries that you're going to have to set. You're not going to let anybody walk all over you. Those are things that you have to do. Validating emotions is important and should be one of the first steps in de-escalating someone who's upset. Setting boundaries is also important. This means not letting the individual walk all over you in their rage and upset state. Assert your boundaries as a human being. That's particularly important when you're working on someone who, like maybe if you have a conflict with a boss or a coworker, it's really important for you to separate yourself and say, you know what? I'm I'm Bree. I may be, your coworker, and I might be the customer service specialist, and that's the capacity that we work in, but I'm also an individual. I have an identity outside of work, or maybe I have an identity outside of, being your daughter, something like that. So you have to be able to separate yourself from that as well. And we'll actually talk about that more because I actually have a special section working with conflict and coworkers. So note the difference between assertive and aggressive. So important. Avoid being forceful in your boundary setting, but be sure you're maintaining your self-respect. Be kind but firm and use compassion to set an expectation. So it's the minute that you cross that line from assertive to aggressive that you lose in conflict resolution, right? You're done when you start becoming aggressive, because then it escalates, there's no resolution, everybody leaves upset. So that's a really fine line to walk, but you definitely have to find the way to do that, to maintain that. Step 7, take responsibility. Whether or not an apology is in order, it's a worthwhile approach to take responsibility for the disruption when you can. So you don't have to say, you know what, I'm sorry that this whole thing happened, blah, 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 but I'm not accountable for it. There's a difference between I'm sorry and I'm responsible. So at some point, it would be totally appropriate to say, you know what, I am sorry. I took that last cupcake. I'm responsible for that, and I'm sorry. And moving forward, we will do better. So there's not one person that I have met yet that has had some conflict that hasn't appreciated the responsibility, that someone takes responsibility for their actions. Apologize where an apology is due, and don't let your pride stand in the way of making amends. Again, just make sure that you take responsibility and you apologize when it's necessary and appropriate. Put yourself in the individual's shoes and think about what you'd like to hear if you were them. Taking responsibility isn't only about owning up to where you may have contributed to the problem, but also how you're going to manage the solution. So once you take responsibility for the conflict, your portion of the conflict, what you were involved in the conflict, then it's your turn to also take responsibility to move forward and find the solution, your conflict resolution. Focus on a solution. So this is step 8, the final step. Once emotions have been validated and addressed, it's time to move past the conflict, working collaboratively with an individual to determine the right solution. Build upon what you just learned from hearing the individual's grievances. Offer what you can to bridge the gap between yourself and the individual to limit future frustrations. So this is important, of course, because it's your last step, right? When you reach your resolution, then the conflict is over. There's actually a lot to the step. It's just not that simple. What you have to do is sometimes you have to do a little give and take, right? So you have to collaborate with the individual that you're having the conflict with and come to that solution where you both feel satisfied. Now, it's very easy to say that and much, much more difficult to actually have that. So, I mean, if you guys kind of had a solution from the beginning, there wouldn't really be any conflict, right? So this is where you have to, again, swallow your pride and say, it's more important for me to have this resolution that we both agree on than it is for me to be right or for me to get my way or, whatever the case may be. So that can be very difficult as well, but you definitely want to remain flexible in the fact that sometimes you're going to have to give something up to reach the resolution of the conflict. Okay. I'm just blowing right through this, so this might be a short session today. My next session or section and the last section is navigating conflict at work. So I had said earlier that I entered the workforce at 14. That was nearly 30 years ago. So in that 30 years, and I'm sure some of you might have more or less experience, but I can assure you that all of you in the workforce have come up with some conflict with a coworker, right? Sometimes there's just a coworker that you just don't like, and you're not even sure why. Like your personalities don't mesh. You just don't like them. They give off the wrong vibe. Or maybe you're best friends with one of your coworkers, and at some point something work related comes up and it then causes conflict between you. So conflict is a constant at work. And so we're going to talk about just a few simple steps to make conflict a non-issue. So when there is conflict at work, issues created can affect the entire workplace, right? The people your company serve are being affected. So when you have, like, I was shopping at Walmart not too long ago, and there were two employees that were arguing with each other, like fighting with each other. There was, swear words going on. There was all kinds of stuff. And it made me feel really uncomfortable because I don't like to see that kind of conflict. And it affected me. So I was going to buy something in that section, but because they were there fighting, I walked away and didn't return. So no matter where the conflict is, it's going to boil over into the people that you guys serve for whatever, wherever you work, no matter what. Pretty soon the conflict can become personal. And when you have a conflict that's personal, it's much more escalated and it gets around your workplace, right? Employees are losing respect for each other because employees are talking about each other behind their back or spreading rumors. There's gossip. Nobody knows what's true except for the two people involved in the conflict, but everybody's hearing it and they're losing respect. Employee morale is low. I don't know if you guys have ever had that coworker who kind of complains all the time. I've had one or two of those. And when they complain constantly about a conflict with another coworker, conflict with the people that our agency served or whatever, it really made my morale low. It was very difficult to keep, I'm a pretty upbeat person and it wore on me. It wore me down. And those are things that can affect you even wanting to come into work that day. Sometimes it's just easier to say, you know what, I'm not feeling good today. I just can't come in. But the real reason is that you don't want to face that conflict. You don't want that negative aura in your workplace, that kind of stuff. Productivity is being affected. Once again, when the drama kind of happens, when conflict becomes drama and that gossip is happening and the personal conflict has become everybody's issue, then you're focused more on that than you are productivity, right? So you're not doing your work, you're focusing on all the drama because it's human nature to like to want to know what's happening. And so that can be an issue as well. And then employees threaten to resign or walk out. When things get really bad and you have two employees, maybe more, that really dislike each other and really affect the vibe of your workplace, it's not worth it to stay most of the time, right? Like that's how you're feeling. You're like, I can't, like I just talked about calling in sick because you don't like the vibe at your workplace and you'd rather just not deal with it. So if you have a heavy conflict vibe in your agency or your workplace, wherever you're at, then it's really, you're going to lose employees because nobody's having fun with that. So what can you do? Right? Like you know that you have a conflict, you know that one of your coworkers has a conflict with the other. Act quickly. Like don't let it escalate. So every day that goes by, it's going to escalate into something more because another rumor is going to start, more gossip is going to go, someone else is going to find out about the conflict, and it's just going to spread like wildfire. So if you notice even the slightest of conflict between yourself and a coworker, or maybe even two coworkers, don't ignore it. Act before it has a chance to get out of hand. So I think this is hard for people in the sense that, if I have two coworkers who are in conflict, I'm like, you know what? It's not my business. I don't, hands off, right? Like, I don't want to talk to them about it because it's not my business. And so I just go about my day ignoring it, whatever. But again, the problem is that eventually, if that conflict isn't resolved, it's going to affect my daily work life, right? Because that's going to, the whole, feeling, the whole atmosphere is going to change. So sometimes you might have to take that uncomfortable step and say, hey guys, I know that you have this conflict. Can we maybe work on a resolution? Which seems like you're maybe prying a little bit, and it certainly is uncomfortable, but it's important. And when it's yourself, if you feel like someone has a conflict with you and it's just maybe even the slightest little slight, then it's really important to say, hey, is there something that I can change? Is there something I can do better? What's affecting us right now? Like, why are we off? Remember, the effects of conflict at work are never limited to those directly involved. The sooner a matter is under control, the less potential widespread damage it can do. So I've already said this multiple times. Excuse me. But if you let that conflict resolution just go and let it and don't try to stop it, it's going to affect everything and everybody. Talk about it. This is another very uncomfortable step, right? So you've approached your coworker or you've approached the two coworkers with conflict and you say, we need to find a resolution to this before it affects the company. Well, okay, but what do you do after you say you need to find that? That step towards resolution. You talk about it. Be brave and take the first step of resolving an issue. Ask your coworker if they would like to sit down and discuss any issues. Each person should be able to give their thoughts without interruption. Remember to be open to discussion, compromise, and negotiation. Also, leave the defensiveness at the door. So in the general conflict resolution, we talked about the defensiveness, right? If you're defensive, it's not going to be an effective step towards conflict resolution. You want to continue that when you're having conflict with a coworker. You need to be open. And that second part, I think, is actually the most important part of this step, which is each person should be able to give their thoughts without interruption. That's really important too, of course, because you want to get your thoughts out. There's rarely anything that's more frustrating than when you're trying to explain to someone, when you're trying to communicate with someone, you're trying to be open with someone, and they interrupt you because it becomes defensive, right? So they say, well, last week on this day, you did this and then that person pipes in and says, well, that's not what I did, or that's not what I meant. That's not effective. So as hard as it may be to remain quiet when someone is accusing you of something, it is super important to do that because you want to be heard. You want to be heard without interruption, and they want to be heard without interruption. And if there are no interruptions, then it's just going to bring you that much closer to resolution and not escalate the problem. But it is really easy to try to defend yourself when someone comes after you, and that can be very difficult and uncomfortable, but it's really important to keep yourself open to that. Be neutral. So this is the entire slide because I think it's really self-explanatory. Be neutral. Again, very difficult, especially in a workplace, to be neutral. But you have to be. You have to come at it from a neutral spot, or you're not going to want to receive that feedback that that person is giving you. And again, sometimes it can feel like a personal attack, right? If someone's saying something about they don't like that you do at your job, or the quality of your work, or whatever the conflict is, it's really hard to hear someone criticize you, but you have to remain neutral, because if you don't, then it's going to escalate and it's going to get worse. So when you start to discuss, you're both sitting down at the table and you start discussing what the issues are, you want to stick to the facts only, right? Ask questions to identify the exact nature of the underlying problem, right? We don't want all that fluff around it that people often add to the issue. You just want to cut straight to what the issue is, what the underlying problem is. Do not focus on the individual personalities. This is really hard sometimes, because sometimes the reason that you have conflict with someone is because your personalities just don't, match. You're in completely different personalities, and it's very difficult for each one of you to understand the other. So it's really difficult sometimes. But instead of saying like, oh, hey, I just don't like your personality, which would be not good, you could just say, sometimes I feel like you come across a bit abrasive. So it's all about approach, and it's all about the facts only, right? So you might not like their personality, but there are reasons you don't like their personality. They could be abrasive, they could be shy, they could be, too loud, any of that stuff. But you just got to figure out how to say it without offending anybody. Keep your attention on work issues only. Be assertive and listen objectively and empathically. So again, this is where it's hard, because you're trying to get to this conflict resolution, and there's clearly issues between you and somebody else, but you have to be kind and empathetic to them, right? So that can be, again, very difficult to handle when you're talking about yourself in some resolution that way. To sum it up, find a resolution. A solution that favors one party only could lead to resentment and future conflicts between those same persons. Yes, it's important to work toward potential solutions that would be positive for all involved, right? So this goes back to our general conflict resolution too, but I feel like in the coworker aspect, it's in the workplace, it's much more important. It's important for those solutions to have both sides agree to, right? And again, this is where you're going to want to give and take. You're going to have to be flexible. You're going to have to say, all right, well, maybe I'm okay with this, but I'm not okay with that. What's a better solution? That is something that I can agree to, and that I'm able to commit to. And certainly, when a solution favors one party over the other, it leads to resentment. I've had that happen in a workplace before, and it really does. It does nothing to, they might say, oh, conflict resolved, but it's not, because you're not okay with the resolution. And then for me, it just made me resent that person, and I was grumpy, and I was sometimes very short with that person, and it didn't help. It just continued the conflict, by not acknowledging that there was still conflict, right? Like that's what happens. You say it's resolved, we're good, but it's not, and there's still conflict. And the worst thing that you can do is ignore or pretend that that conflict isn't there. It's best to come up with more than one solution to ensure there's no bias, or to ask the conflicting parties to provide 3 solutions that they feel would be fair. I personally like the 3 solutions. One of my other positions at the Northern Michigan Regional Entity is the SUD, Recipient Rights Advisor for the region. And when I do investigations for that, I ask the individual who's filing the complaint what their resolution would look like. Like if they could resolve this, if there was an acceptable resolution to their rights complaint, what would it be? And that is so effective, because then I can work with the agency who has the violation to come up with a solution that works both for the agency and the recipient. And it's magnificent. It works. It has not worked yet. And I think that that's a really great idea. It's also a really good idea to do it with the 3 solutions, so that you guys can put your solutions together and compromise and be flexible and say, again, this works for me, but this doesn't. What's another idea that we could put in that place? You know, that to me is the best way to find a resolution. After identifying potential solutions, agree on one that meets both needs, and then you have to commit to it. So after you reach that resolution, after you both say, yep, this is what's going to work for us, you have to commit to that. Because if you don't commit to that, then the conflict's going to, it'll stir up again at some point. So you definitely that's why it's so important to come up with a solution that works for you. Because if you're not committed to it, you're not going to stick with it. And then 3 months down the road, you're going to be right back in the same spot that you are now. And it essentially means the conflict resolution process is a moot point, right? So that is it. Are there any questions?
I didn't have any Bree in chat.
Okay.
But I guess we want to reiterate also, there is programs on communication and conflict resolution also in My Strength, and the codes are listed here as NLCMH Community and NCCMH COMM is our North Country My Strength code. If anyone wanted further information, as I said, we will have Bree's PowerPoint at the end of all these programs, the end of May, and it'll be on our websites. And I think our next one is A Dose of Life, which is next Tuesday. So I'm hoping everyone will join us on that. That's on increasing balance for happy hormones to become more resilient by taking control and living your best life. So the classes are usually Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we just appreciate everyone coming. Here's a question. What would you suggest if the other person is being argumentative and will not see your perspective?
Oh yeah, that's a tough one. Because as much as you might want that conflict resolution, maybe the other person's not ready for that. And that's how I would approach it, right? So at a time when you guys aren't, if you're speaking to each other and it becomes escalated at that point, I would step away and come back another time and say, listen, if you're being argumentative, I want this to be resolved. But if you're going to be argumentative with me, then it's not going to work. Is this something that you can do to figure out our conflict resolution? And then if they would continue to stay argumentative even after that, I think unfortunately, sometimes people are just that way. That's just how they are. They're defensive. They're not in the right mindset. So it would really boil down to how much of it you can take. But I would first approach them and just say, hey, I really want to make a resolution to this, agree upon something. But in order to do that, we need to remain calm and level-headed and, not aggressive. Also, you could share this PowerPoint with them. It's
Mhm.
like, just say, hey, here's this, on these steps of not taking things personally and what you can do for conflict resolution. So I really hope that works out for you because that's a tough one.
Was there any other questions? I don't see any in chat yet. All
You're
right.
welcome. Yeah,
I
thank you everybody for coming today. Oh, I'm sorry, Tim. I saw that. It's past that. Um, yeah, it's a tough situation to be in for sure. Because again, the other person's going to want to work on that conflict resolution with you, and that's a good point. That maybe, if I present this at another point in time, that I should make that you really have to work with someone um, who wants to work with you on it, and it's not going to work if they don't.
I think that's it.
That's the
Thank you
wrap.
again
Mhm.
very much, Bree. Wonderful presentation. Oh, here's a question. What if
Sure.
the conflict is with your boss or supervisor?
Yeah, so that can be very difficult, right? And I've actually had some conflict with supervisors before, and it's a really uncomfortable. Let me turn my camera back on. I'm sorry, forgot. It's a really uncomfortable place to be, especially because there are things that you fear like, well, this is my job. Am I jeopardizing my job? Is something, is there going to be long-term repercussions to that? It's very difficult, very unfun place to be. What I did was I had to work up the courage, and it took me about 2 weeks, if I'm going to be completely honest, to work up that courage to speak to my boss. And I just went into her office and I said, listen, something's been bothering me, and I really need to settle this. So I really need to talk to you, and it's about you and me. And I approached it very openly and very honestly. In the long term, it worked out. There weren't any long-term repercussions. My job was fine. But there's also, if you have a conflict with your boss, it might also be helpful to bring in a third party. And I would be very choosy about who your third party is. It would have to be someone who would be neutral. Maybe if you have a agency that has an HR department, or your boss has a boss, um, and just say, hey, I would really like to get some conflict resolution here, but I don't really know how to approach it, or I need some help approaching it. So you can bring in that third party, or you can find the courage. The key to approaching your boss when you have a conflict with them is basically to not be accusatory. That's the best thing to do, right? Like, you don't want to go into your boss's office and be like, you're doing this, this, and this, and I don't like it, and we need to resolve it. You know what I'm saying? So you just go in and you say, like I did, like, hey, I just have this issue and it needs to be resolved so that I can move forward and can do my job more productively and that kind of thing. So it can be a very uncomfortable place to be. And if it's too uncomfortable for you to approach yourself, find that third party that can help you, almost like a mediator. That's what I would do.
Any additional questions? I don't see anything else in chat, Bree. Thank
Okay.
you again. Thank you
Yeah.
again. Wonderful, wonderful information for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending.